History Grade 10 Short Note O Level. Sources of studying history. Classification of sources. What is history? History is a subject that studies past human activities. What are sources in history? Writings and various creations made by people in the past are called sources because information about past human activities can be extracted from them. What do sources tell us about the past? Sources provide a good understanding of different eras, their social backgrounds, and the lives of people during those times. How is history formed using sources? When the information from sources is studied logically, the history of people's lives in each period is formed. How are sources for studying history classified? Sources are mainly divided into two types: literary sources, archaeological sources. What are literary sources? Books and documents written at different time periods by people who lived in the past are considered literary sources. What are archaeological sources? Relics, monuments, coins, inscriptions, and various ruins unearthed from archaeological excavations and experiments are called archaeological sources. Why are literary and archaeological sources important? They help to study the history of Sri Lanka by providing valuable information about the past. How are literary sources used to study the history of Sri Lanka categorized? Literary sources are categorized into two types: local literary sources, foreign literary sources. What are local literary sources? Texts written by Sri Lankans in prose and poetry formed from about 2000 years ago are considered local literary sources. What are foreign literary sources? Books written by foreigners who were interested in Sri Lanka, or books that include information about Sri Lanka written by foreign writers, are called foreign literary sources. What is the oldest local literary source in Sri Lanka? Deepavamsa is considered the oldest local literary source in Sri Lanka. When was Deepavamsa written? Deepavamsa was written around the 4th century Anno Domini, also known as AD. What historical information does Deepavamsa contain? Deepavamsa includes historical information of Sri Lanka up to the end of King Mahasena's ruling period, description of the history of the Buddhist order Sasana in Sri Lanka. On what material were ancient literary and religious information written in Sri Lanka? Ancient literary and religious information as well as the Vamsakatha were written on Ola leaves. What tradition does Sri Lanka inherit regarding the ancient writings? Sri Lanka inherits a tradition of telepods, which belong to a long period of time. How were some historical events recorded in Deepavamsa? Some historical events were recorded briefly in Deepavamsa. Why was Mahavamsa composed? Mahavamsa was composed as a historical chronicle with fewer mistakes than Deepavamsa, addressing issues like brief recordings and repetitions. Who wrote the first part of Mahavamsa? The first part of Mahavamsa was written by a bhikkhu named Mahanama, who lived in the Diksanda Senaviya Pirivena monastery. What does the first part of Mahavamsa cover? The first part of Mahavamsa consists of historical information of Sri Lanka from the arrival of the Lord Buddha to the end of the ruling time of King Mahasena. When was the first part of Mahavamsa written? The first part of Mahavamsa was written in the 5th or 6th century Anno Domini. What similarity exists between Deepavamsa and the first part of Mahavamsa? There is a certain similarity between Deepavamsa and the first part of Mahavamsa due to the influence of early texts such as Sihela Atthakatha, Mahavamsa, Uttara Vihara Atthakatha, and Vinaya Atthakatha, which were written before these two sources. What is the reason for the similarity between Deepavamsa and Mahavamsa? The similarity may be due to the influence of early texts like Sihela Atthakatha, Mahavamsa, Uttara Vihara Atthakatha, and Vinaya Atthakatha, which were foundational sources for both Deepavamsa and Mahavamsa. Who extended Mahavamsa after Mahanama Thero? After Mahanamatero, other writers extended Mahavamsa by adding information about their contemporary time periods from time to time. Why can Sri Lankans be proud of Mahavamsa? Sri Lankans can be proud of Mahavamsa because Mahavamsa is one of the limited number of countries whose history has been written in one continuous text. What makes Mahavamsa a credible historical source? Mahavamsa is considered a credible historical source because some historical events recorded in it have been substantiated by inscriptions and other sources. What is Mahavamsa Tikava? Mahavamsa Tikava, also known as Vansattapakkasini, is an annotation compiled to interpret Mahavamsa by explaining certain areas. What makes Mahavamsa Tikava significant? Mahavamsa Tikava consists of a lot of information that is not available in some other sources, making it a valuable historical text. What are some examples of ancient literary sources with different content? Types of source examples. Types of source Sandesha Kavya, examples such as Maurya Tisara, Salalini Sandesha. Prashasti Kavya, examples such as Parakumba Sirita. Hatan Kavya, examples such as Sitavaka Hatana, Konstantinu Hatana, Ingirisi Hatana, from which eras were local literary works written in Sri Lanka. Local literary works were written from the Anuradhapura era to the Kandyan era of Sri Lanka. History. Name some important Buddhist religious texts mentioned in the note. Some important Buddhist religious texts include Bodhivamsa, Thupavamsa, Dhatuvamsa, Pujavaliya, and Saddharma Lankarya. What is the significance of these literary works? These literary works provide valuable insights into the history of Rajarata civilization and are essential for understanding the cultural and religious aspects of Sri Lankan history. How do these texts contribute to historical studies? These texts contribute by preserving and documenting the religious, social, and political aspects of ancient Sri Lankan civilization, making them crucial for historical studies. What are the two important sources for studying history from the Gampala to Kotte period? The Nikaya Sangrahaya, which covers the history of the Buddhist order Sasana, and Rajavaliya, which includes political information of the country, are important sources for studying the period. What sources are significant for studying the history between the Kotte and Kandy periods? Sandesha Kavya, Prashasti Kavya, and Hatan Kavya are important sources for studying the history between the Kotte and Kandy periods. What was the primary reason for writing books from the Anuradhapura era to the beginning of Kotte era? The primary reason for writing books during this period was religious objectives. Why do we need to be cautious when referring to literary sources for history? We need to be cautious because some books were written a few centuries after the historical incidents they describe. Therefore, when performing history using these sources, we must consider the time in which the sources were written, the author of the source, the author's objectives, the way in which facts were obtained for the source. Understanding these factors help ensure a more accurate interpretation of historical events. Why did foreign sources include information about Sri Lanka? Foreign sources include information about Sri Lanka because the country maintained trade relationships with foreign countries. From the early period of the Anuradhapura era, many foreigners engaged in trade activities in the Indian Ocean were aware of Sri Lanka and recorded it in their books. How did India contribute to foreign information about Sri Lanka? India had a close relationship with Sri Lanka, and some Indian books mention information about Sri Lanka due to the historical and cultural ties between the two regions. Which Tamil books include information about Sri Lanka? Tamil books such as Silappatikaram, Manimekalai, and Padurupattu include information about Sri Lanka. When did some foreigners start writing books with separate information about Sri Lanka? After the arrival of the Portuguese in Sri Lanka in the 16th century, some foreigners began writing books with separate information about Sri Lanka. What type of foreign writers are identified in relation to Sri Lanka? There were two types of foreign writers regarding Sri Lanka. Writers who came to Sri Lanka and studied the country firsthand. Writers who did not visit Sri Lanka but inquired information about the country from others and then wrote about it. What are the uses of literary sources in studying history? Literary sources are used for preparing the historical chronology, obtaining information about political, economic, and social affairs in each era, substantiating the information provided by one source with another source, studying the international relations with Sri Lanka of a country where foreign sources are very important. Which foreign authors came to Sri Lanka and wrote about it? Chinese sources: Fa Hsien Thero's traveling accounts, account on Buddhist kingdom. Arabian sources: Ibn Battuta's traveling accounts. Portuguese sources: Ribeiro's books on Sri Lanka, Ribeiro's Lankan history. Holland sources: the book of Philippus Baldius, the Sri Lankan Chronicle of Baldius. English sources: Robert Knox books, and historical relationship of the island Ceylon, Sinhala translation Edheladivel are some books that include them. How can archaeological sources be divided? Archaeological sources can be divided into following categories: epigraphy, coins, ruins, drawings, sculptures, antiquities. What does the term epigraphy refers to? Epigraphy refers to writings inscribed on stones, shila, clay slabs, false copper plates, golden plates, wood, and various urns. What are inscriptions on stone slabs or rocks called? Inscriptions on stone slabs or rocks are called sellipi, shilalipi inscriptions. How can inscriptions be categorized based on the shapes of the stones? Inscriptions can be categorized into cave inscriptions, rock inscriptions, or girilipi, pile inscriptions, also known as tamlipi, slab inscriptions, also known as porlipi. Who was Claudius Ptolemy? Claudius Ptolemy was a Greek Roman geographer who lived in Alexandria between 90 to 168 Anno Domini. What was Claudius Ptolemy's contribution related to Sri Lanka? Claudius Ptolemy drew a map of Sri Lanka. Thanks for watching this video. Please make sure to leave us a comment and a like, and make sure to subscribe so you can get all the videos that we publish.